My name's Charles Nadler, co-chair with Ian of the Interneighborhood Cooperation Zoning and Planning Committee. And we're now going to have a panel discussion, the experienced history of design in Denver. On my far left is Veronica Barela, past president and CEO of NewZed CDC. Next to her is Ron Abbo, architect. And next to him is Alan Gass, architect. And then right next to me is Dana Crawford, Urban Neighborhoods, Inc. Of Larimer Square and Union Station fame. So I'm going to just start it off. I've talked to the members of the panel before we came in here, and the two basic questions for them, and hopefully we will have a panel discussion, and then at some point we can entertain some questions. But the two questions we had were, one, what is the thing that has worked best in the past, and what is the thing that has worked the least in the past in Denver in terms of urban design? And I'm sure that each will have different things that they have picked out, and that will hopefully lead to an interesting discussion. So Veronica, you want to start?
No, but is this on?
It should be.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? I like that commercial. There we go. Good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences with community development when I was the president and CEO of NewZed Community Development Corporation. And so I'm going to talk about basically what worked to revitalize Santa Fe Drive and turn the community around. And you know, I guess that, I mean, I can think of things that didn't work, but overall, what I wanted to talk about was the community involvement and how that worked. NewZed wrote a concept paper for the city for an urban development action grant back in the, around 1977, 76, around there, because of the displacement of the Auraria neighborhood, and the building of the Auraria campus displaced a third of the neighborhood back at that time, which was real devastating to the community. And the city won a $13.5 million urban development action grant, which created back then a $110 million project called the Parkway Center. And what was interesting about the Parkway Center is Bud Brady was the contractor, and he knew the King Soopers people, and we got the largest King Soopers in the west side, in the state of Colorado, and the busiest, when at that time many inner city neighborhood grocery stores were closing down. So it was really a good a good deal for the west side, and they really did hire community people. You know, the challenges were, though, is how you bring that community together and what the UDAG was going to be used for, because beyond just the Parkway Center, it was used to revitalize Lawma Lincoln Park, and only Lawma Lincoln Park. So the money was it was well spent, and it was the beginning of the revitalization of Santa Fe Drive. And so during that time, before the UDAG happened, and the reason NewZed wrote this concept paper was there were many charrettes in the city, or in the neighborhood, around what happened to the to the Auraria neighborhood. and hundreds of people would show out. So it was a great community participation, and it sort of defined the path that was headed for the West Side at that time. We needed to sort of get that middle-income community back in that neighborhood, and that's basically what we did. But beyond that, we had about $3 million to renovate each block. And so the West Side Design Center at the time that NewSed worked with helped organize block-by-block participation, and Robert and Linda Alvarado were the contractors on that. So we had like $12,000 per block so that the residents could either have new fencing. If you look down Galapago, there's all this wrought iron fencing. There was streetscaping, curb cuts, all this wonderful things that were going on in the West Side. We even did some work in the 2 housing projects at the time. And so that was a great project. It was a wonderful project in terms of bringing the community together and meeting block by block and organizing that. And the West Side was just beautiful after that. We need another UDAG.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah, yeah. And so that's basically was also the beginning of NewSed's goal to revitalize Santa Fe Drive. And so we created the Merchants Association and a neighborhood organization and started from there. And now Santa Fe Drive has, it needs maintenance, that's for sure. It's got 35 years of deferred maintenance, huh, David? And we're working on that with the city right now. And we're hoping we can, widen those sidewalks and make it a more pedestrian-friendly walking community than it is now. As you know, in 1965, after the flood, they made Calumet and Santa Fe one-ways and just destroyed the walkability of Santa Fe Drive anyway. I think what was really successful on Santa Fe Drive in bringing the merchants together was the Santa Fe Drive Redevelopment Corporation and NewSed working together. And now the Santa Fe has the nationally known arts district and First Fridays. So if you ever get a chance to go down on Santa Fe on First Friday, you will really enjoy yourself. At that time, there were about 12 neighborhood business revitalization areas in the city, and it was a great program, and it really involved the merchants on all those areas. There was Colfax, Morrison Road, 5 Points, Broadway, Santa Fe, a whole bunch of areas that, the city had a revolving loan fund that was zero interest, and, offset that with the private sector lender. The city would loan up to 50%. And what you saw happening all over the city as we all worked together was the many businesses popping up all over this city. The city has since gotten rid of that program, which is really unfortunate. I was hoping, these new council people would start re-looking at that business support office and those revolving loan funds to help these businesses in these areas across the city. But I think what's really important when we were working in these areas was the streetscaping going on. Santa Fe just, had the beautiful colored sidewalks, lamps, new trash cans, just everything that you would need. And we had architectural guidelines for folks to follow. And so it was a real effort by the city and the community. We called them triangular partnerships back then. It was a private, public, and community sector efforts to revitalize an area. And you saw that happening pretty much all over the city with these neighborhood business revitalization areas. 32nd and Lowell was the first one. And so these kind of efforts, I think, coming together and working together and creating your architectural guidelines and what you want that neighborhood to look like is really important. And you have to do it with the community. You have to have some community organizing experiences to bring those folks together to do these kind of things. Because a lot of things in the West Side, there was a coalition that didn't really do much of anything until some other groups came along. And the cooperation with the neighborhood organizations at that time was really important, like Mikasa and the Denver Inner City Parish, the West Side Action Center before it went away, and of course NewSed. And these kind of efforts are really important. And then you reach out to other neighborhoods and see what they're doing and take from their experience. So I hope I'm not rambling on, but that's probably the long and short of my experience of being with NewSed for 40 years.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about community design and my experience with it. I grew up in Denver. I grew up in North Denver, which is now Highlands. And I went to the University of Colorado at Boulder School of Architecture, and my classmate Ray Kreitz is sitting right over here. But when we were in our 5th year, and then it was a 5-year bachelor's program, in our 5th year we had a thesis problem. And instead of the traditional ivory tower thesis problem, our professors gave us an option to come to Denver and have a design center experience. Model Cities was active at that time, and so some of us went to the west side, Veronica's neighborhood, and some into northeast Denver on Welton, Five Points. And back in those days, there was no community participation in any of the city projects. It was very rare. So like if there was a recreation center that was to be built in a neighborhood, the Public Works Department would have a prototype that they would just put into that neighborhood, whether or not they needed a swimming pool or not, or an additional basketball court or whatever. It was, just the standard thing, and neighbors weren't, or the citizens weren't consulted. So in our experience, we became the advocate for the residents, that we would engage them in the process, go to the city and talk to them about what the neighborhood needed. And I think that was really kind of the beginning of participation in city projects. So, Veronica talked about this neighborhood business revitalization program, and so early in my career as an architect, in my practice, the mayor at that time was Bill McNichols, and he had a community development director, Lou LaPerriere, and a young man, Bill Lysott, was tasked with this neighborhood business revitalization program. And I think Bill came from a banking background, but he was pretty savvy about, how to make businesses successful, small businesses. And he also valued design, which, it's kind of rare for a financial guy to do in those days. But and we're talking in the late 70s, early 80s. So the neighborhood business revitalization program was designed to keep sales tax leakage happening in the city. So, a lot of these small neighborhood business areas like 32nd and Lowell, 5 Points and South Broadway, Tennyson, they were declining, and all the businesses were moving out to the regional shopping malls. So the city created this revolving loan program. Bill, with his foresight, required those areas to first become organized, to develop or to organize a merchants association, so that they had an organization. They did joint marketing, and then the city, the city created a mechanism to allow my firm to help the residents establish design standards for their specific district. You know, what would make their district unique. And then the city had this revolving loan program where they would lend half, or in certain cases even a little more, at no interest, and then they engaged local neighborhood banks to loan the other half at their going interest rate. And back then, the interest rates were hovering around 10%. And then, in the case of 32nd and Lowell, they said, if 60% of the businesses participate in the loan program, then we will come in and redo the street, underground the utilities, new sidewalks, trees, street furniture, and so they did that at 32nd and Lowell and Tennyson and Welton Street, and I think the program was very successful. So, you know, it's an example where the city provided some incentive, but they relied on the local merchants, you know, to create their own organization and to do this as a group. You know, I live in Wheat Ridge now, and you know, we're starting to go through a neighborhood revitalization strategy, and you know, hopefully we can learn some of those lessons that Denver had in terms of being able to reinvest in small business and revitalize some of these old commercial corridors that we have. So anyway, that's kind of my story. And you know, just recently in Kevin's district here, we worked with a group of Southeast Asian businesses on the 1000 block of South Federal to revitalize a strip shopping center. And you know, these things take a lot of time too. You know, it's not something that you can just, you know, do the design in 6 months and a year later have a finished product. In fact, this started maybe 10 years ago when I was on the Asian Pacific American Commission. We focused on South Federal as an area that you know, could use some help. And we had a town hall meeting, and out of that town hall meeting came the realization that the businesses on South Federal were declining. You know, they were now second and third generation businesses from, you know, the Vietnam War era, the refugees that came, and you know, wouldn't it be a shame to lose, you know, that cultural identity in the city? And so we started to focus on this one block, and within that strip shopping center, there were 15 different owners of those different businesses, and Dura was involved because they had a TIF for that area. And that money was going to revert back to the city coffers because people weren't taking advantage of the TIF financing to reinvest into their businesses. So it took a lot of kind of community development to get those businesses together, to get them organized, to convince them that this was a good idea. And so finally, I think just a few months ago, the last piece was done. So anyway, that's my story.
I don't think this one, is this one working? Great.
Speak up.
I'm going to speak up. Thank you,
Okay.
Dana. I don't have much of a voice. I apologize.
But he has a lot to say.
I have two examples. I'll probably get to only one of them, but since this is a citizen action group, I would like to talk about my experience with what happened to be at the time the first Citizens Advisory Committee that I'm aware of that was ever done in Colorado. And that was in about 1964. I was about 2 years into a new architectural practice, and one day Jim Sudler, who was a very prominent architect at that time and a person I had worked for before, called me and asked me if I would like to represent the American Institute of Architects chapter on a Citizens Advisory Committee that was being set up to study and advise the State Division of Highways on a new project which the 5 counties had put together called the Denver Metropolitan Area Transportation Study, DMATS. Having studied urban design in graduate school and attended what turned out to be the first international conference on urban design before I finished school, I guess that's why Jim asked me to do this. In any case, I attended the first meeting up with a high school friend of mine who I hadn't seen for some time, Bert Melcher, who was a structural engineer at that time. And a number of attorneys were involved. John Moore, who was a very prominent attorney with Holland and Hart at that time, and Jerry Conover. They were very active in a group called Power in the country club area. The Denver Metropolitan Area Transportation Study had a number of improvements to what they said were improvements to the highway system around Denver to increase mobility. Those included about 5 new freeways, which would increase mobility considerably. But from our point of view, those freeways were going to do an immense amount of damage. One of those freeways, called the Skyline Freeway, would have bisected downtown, would have taken out the block between Larimer and Market Street, connecting I-25 and I-70. The Columbine Freeway would have gone through about the orientation of probably Downing Street, would have taken out probably Downing and Corona Street from I-70 to I-25 south. There was a 6th Avenue freeway which was proposed, which would continue the 6th Avenue freeway across East Denver, taking out all of East 6th Avenue as we know it and the 6th Avenue Parkway, going through Lowry Field after its mission had been taken out. And then there was a circumferential freeway which was designated later on I-470. Those were all parts of this plan. Now this committee was not just ordinary citizens. It was a number of neighborhood people. It was people who represented League of Women Voters, some neighborhood associations. It also had representatives of the heavy highway construction companies, had representatives of the paving contractors, the paving suppliers. It had a representative of the AAA, obviously, a representative of the Chamber of Commerce. It was quite diverse in its composition. You may all remember Kathy Donahue, who was later a member of City Council. She was also a member of this group representing a Capitol Hill neighborhood. Together, we had a series of meetings trying to analyze these freeway routes. We came to a number of conclusions about the damage that we felt the freeways were going to do to the fabric of Denver. And we published ultimately what we called our analysis of the DMATS program. That analysis made a number of recommendations. It also made recommendations of which of those freeways might not be the greatest idea. Fortunately, some of our recommendations were picked up. We have Larimer Square now because the Skyline Freeway didn't happen. And we fortunately have been able to preserve East 6th Avenue through the work of the Power Organization combined with our Citizens Advisory Committee. And Columbine Freeway didn't happen as well. The one thing we were not successful in, we could not stop I-470. Ultimately, we made a major effort, and we convinced Governor Dick Lamb at that time to, as he tried to do, to put a silver stake through that project. Mixed metaphor, of course. He was unsuccessful. He was unsuccessful in fighting off a legal challenge, and although he was able to take some federal money out of the project and have it redesignated as a Colorado state highway, the project went ahead, as you well know. But that was the effort of what I believe is the first citizen participation in a major effort in the state.
It's working, but I have this big voice. Well, thank you all very much for being here, and I think you would join me in thanking the first three speakers because obviously they've saved us quite a lot of trouble. But we've been in trouble, and in reviewing my experiences with design review, I realized that my politics have been hypocritical. I will just take you back, and because some of you remember, and thank you all for joining in many of the fights, and we're still fighting over Larimer Square, as you may have noticed lately. And you know, I've also observed that we're kind of a senior group here, which always worries me, but right now, we are the ones that really can remember what it was like before there was more citizens' participation and shared vision operating in our particular city. And if you're like I am and drive around now, you kind of wonder at how big and handsome we are all of a sudden. And the trees got really big, and that helped too. But then, of course, in the meantime, Denver's cutting them all down. And so we'll just maybe talk about that a little bit later when we get to the discussion part. But at any rate, Larimer Square was announced in the midst of all the city fathers saying that absolutely no one would go to Larimer Street because it was Skid Row and everyone would be afraid. And it was slated for demolition in all good spirit with most of the rest of lower downtown slated for demolition to make way for an urban renewal project. I announced, or I should say we, because of course it's always a team of people, we announced Larimer Square in May of 1965, and urban renewal had not been passed at that time, and ultimately there was a city council person who requested that there be a public vote, and I worked like a Trojan to get it through. not dreaming that the minute we got it voted through, it would turn around like a dragon and try to get rid of me. That would have been the easier part. But and of course, Larimer Square would go. There was just no merit in it. And they like to describe me as that housewife, which just frosted the hell out of me. But I wore hats and gloves on Larimer Street to just prove that, it all could work out. And really, there wasn't design review at that time, although Urban Renewal said they had design review. And some of the buildings that you see down there existing today, which are representative of some of the worst of the 1950s and 60s, were approved and applauded by the Urban Renewal Authority. But I just was kind of able to fly my own kite in the 1400 block and did so, I'd like to say happily, but it was just an enormous struggle. And there was no city money or really, sometimes there was city help depending on who was mayor at the time. But at any rate, then I began to get more and more involved with Lower Downtown in the 70s and 80s. And of course, Jennifer Moulton was around, that genius and wonderful soul. So then they wanted to designate Lower Downtown as an historic district. And I thought that was fine, but they also wanted to have design review. And I thought that was un-American, that somebody would come in and tell me what I could do with my property. So I actually was very opposed to it, and I have to be extremely embarrassed now, because this is where the hypocritical part comes in. Now I go all over the United States and rave about the benefits of design review. But Lower Downtown simply wouldn't be there as it is now if we had not had design review. And lately, it's kind of wandered off its track, because you may see a few buildings down there that you will wonder how in the world they could be judged complimentary to the historic district. But we probably should just have some cocktails and discuss that. Jennifer was really right, and the district was designated, I think, in 1988. And design review's been operating ever since. And generally, overall, I think that it would get a B+ or an A-. And I know that a lot of times, and I don't know whether this is still true or not, but architects didn't like the idea of design review. But now I think they're a little bit more cheered up about it. And so, it just takes time to get these things done. But you have to be kind of outrageous at a certain point in time in order to get it started and then to get people, for example, housing, living in Lower Downtown. People said no one in Denver would ever want to live in one of those awful old buildings down there. Well, I knew that wasn't true, because during the years in Larimer Square, we always had people coming in from out of town saying, "Where is your loft community?" And everybody would say, "Loft? What's that?" But I knew people wanted to do that. And so we were required to do pre-sales. And it was during the 1980s. And so, of course, there wasn't a bank around that would loan you a penny for anything. In order to get the project done, the first project done for housing, the Edbrook building, the bank said that they would loan me the construction money if I could get half of the units pre-sold, all of the units pre-financed, and Fannie Mae approval. Well, I went to Dallas to Fannie Mae, and they said, the guy was named Bill Pena. What a lovely guy. And he said, "Dana," he said, "you must be out of your mind. We haven't approved a single project in the state of Colorado for 3 years. What makes you think that we would approve this old building down in this stupid old neighborhood with these viaducts going over?" And so it was one time when my self-confidence flagged. I'm thinking, oh, I'm in a lot of trouble. I've got to figure out a way to get out of it. So I asked him, yes. All right, how do I get out of this trouble? And I kind of love to tell this story. So when we're out here in the country, and a lot of times I get nosebleeds out here, but I don't think I will now. But at any rate, I went to talk to Bill Pena about getting Fannie Mae approval. And you know, he gave me that speech. And so I said, well, Mr. Pena, do you come to Denver ever anymore? Just to say no? And he said, well, yeah, and as a matter of fact, a few of us will be in town in 3 weeks. And I said, well, do you like martinis? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, I do. And I said, well, we're having a martini party for you down in that stupid old building in that rotten neighborhood. And you're going to have a good time. And that's all you have to say is yes. So it happened. And he did have a really good time. And I had all the people who had pre-purchased lofts, and I got financing out of San Francisco, so they were pre-financed. And I had all the contracts and all the takeout financing piled up next to the gin and the vodka. So, you know, we succeeded in starting the loft housing. Well, now you know the story, that we have some 65,000 people living in or near that stupid old downtown. So I guess the reason I'm making this point is that whatever the popular idea is at the time, it isn't necessarily the best idea. It may have worked in some other community, but it's not necessarily the best idea. And then you asked about failures on things that are brought about. And in lower downtown, when the urban renewal project was done, they were insisting on second-level walkways between the buildings, the residential buildings, which of course it was very obvious to Alan, who wrote a stunning letter, and to the people in Larimer Square, that this wasn't going to work because everybody would be getting up on that level and, you know, helping themselves to pockets and so forth. But they built them, they spent all the money, and then they had to spend all the money to take them out. So that was the failure. There's a huge amount to talk about here, but in the meantime, I'm eager to get everybody engaged in this conversation, and so I will turn the microphone, which I'm being told I should be better equipped to use, over to Charles.
Thank you. So, do any one of you have a question for other members of the panel?
Well, I want to ask Veronica when she's going to announce that she's running for city council.
Thank you, Dana.
Okay.
I really want to bring to District 3 some of the things that I've learned over 40 years, you know, helping with the West Side and revitalizing Santa Fe Drive and doing a lot of the retail commercial development that I'm really good at. Built 2 shopping centers and a lot of things up and down Santa Fe Drive. So I'm hoping to even work with Kevin if I make it to City Council, because that overlap happens here on Federal, and he's real excited about getting some of that economic development going in his district too.
Okay. Veronica, do you have any questions for any of the other members of the panel?
Well, you know, I really enjoy listening to Dana. I could listen to her all day. She's such an icon in this city and has done so much for historic preservation. And I just want to thank you for that, Dana. Everything that you've done for this city is amazing. It really is. It's amazing. And the city absolutely loves you. And I worked with Ron for a really long time. He designed our grease monkey on 8th and Santa Fe. So I've been, and Alan I just met today, so it was a real pleasure meeting him. But I don't really have any questions.
Okay. Ron, do you have any?
Yeah, I want to ask Alan about his experience working with I.M. Pei and Alan Zeckendorf back in the 50s.
Any of you who really want to know the story probably should attend one of my two tours that I give of downtown for Doors Open Denver. Unfortunately, you can't do that for another year. So it's a long story, but I'll try to make it brief. My association with I.M. Pei really starts when I was in school. This was in, I hate to tell you, probably 1955 or so. My graduate school class had a trip to New York City, and in that trip to New York City, we were taken to a number of projects that were under construction. We were also taken to the fantastic new office that I.M. Pei had recently completed for a developer named William Zeckendorf. Now, perhaps many of you know that name. How many of you know that name? Well, I'll tell you, I usually have 20 people on my tour of downtown Denver. In general, I've given the tour for about 15 years, and in general, 1 or 2 people on that tour know that name. So I'm glad I have some people who recognize the name. You may not all know the history, but I'll get into that. Anyway, we toured the offices with Harry Cobb, who later became one of I.M. Pei's partners. But the story of my association starts right there. Harry showed us a model of the project, which was presently at that time under construction in Denver, called the Mile High Center. Now, I don't know whether any of you even recognize that name anymore. A few of you do. In any case, I didn't think anything of it. I happened to mention to Harry that I was from Denver, but he certainly didn't have my name. Fast forward to the following summer, I came home for summer vacation, and Mr. Sink had called my mother and asked if I would like to be the assistant to the supervising architect of the Mile High Center for the summer. And as it turned out, Mr. Sink was Chuck Sink, who was a very prominent architect in Denver later, but on the 2 projects that I.M. Pei and Zeckendorf did in Denver, he was the associate architect, local in Denver. The reason, really, was that when I.M. Pei was hired by William Zeckendorf to run what he called his architectural division, I.M. Pei was not an independent architect at that time. He brought with him a number of his former students from Harvard. He had been teaching at Harvard, and he brought most of his basic staff for his new firm were former students of his. Chuck Sink was one of those, but he chose not to join him. He came to Denver instead, but that was fortunate because when I.M. Pei came to Denver, there was Chuck Sink. In any case, I should digress slightly so that you will understand just who really William Zeckendorf was. William Zeckendorf had bought a controlling interest in a firm called Webb and Knapp. In the process, he was looking for some land to develop. He had not established a reputation. He found some abandoned slaughterhouses on the east side of Manhattan Island, and he was trying to figure out what to do with all that land that he had optioned. And he had this idea: the UN was looking for a new home, and the United States was trying to keep the UN in the United States. At that time, their headquarters was in San Francisco. And he had the idea that he'd call his friend Nelson Rockefeller and ask Nelson if perhaps his father would like to purchase the land from him and offer it as a gift to the United Nations. Well, the rest of the story I'm sure you know, but what you don't know is that that single real estate transaction made William Zeckendorf a household name in the real estate world, in the real estate world, I guess I should say. At the same time, there was a piece of land in Denver that was in the process, well, it was in motion, I should say that. That piece of land was called Courthouse Square. That was the site of the Arapahoe County Courthouse in Denver between Court Place and Tremont for 15th and 16th Streets. It's a whole block. The Arapahoe County Courthouse had been torn down in the early 30s when Denver became a city and county, and it was at that time already a parking lot, although previous to that time in the late 40s, it had been a city park. It had been a delightful park, and I even remember it, sorry to say. It was a parking lot. It was a gigantic parking lot when it came into play. The city was trying to sell it. They'd had a couple of auctions which had been unsuccessful, and there was a real estate man named B.B. Harding who came into Denver, and he was a Denver native, sorry. B.B. Harding was a Burr Brett Harding, a descendant of both Aaron Burr and Warren Harding, strangely enough. He was quite a radical guy, and he was also a bit of an alcoholic. But he had at that point everybody thought he was on his last legs. Not really. He and Zeckendorf had met occasionally, but one day Harding appeared in Zeckendorf's office and said, "You should buy a Courthouse Square." And Zeckendorf said, "What the hell is that?" Obviously. And Harding went on to explain the possibilities, and Zeckendorf got interested because he was looking for something that he could give to his new architect to work on. It was a very complicated situation. I'll try to fast forward it. The ultimate result was it took about 10 years for Zeckendorf to obtain the land through another couple of failed bidding processes, but he was successful ultimately by making Harding his agent and staying in the background. In the process, however, Zeckendorf wanted to build something in Denver, so he found this other land at 17th and Broadway where he assigned IMPay to do the Mile High Center. Well, that project was quite successful, but I think the ultimate result of what Zeckendorf did was to give Denver a push into the future, because all of a sudden, within a period of about 10 years, he was able to realize two major projects in Denver, which at that time contributed over $50 million to the built environment in downtown Denver. My association continued with IMPay through both of the projects. I worked a little bit on Courthouse Square. I worked a lot on the Mile High Center, and I worked during school. I went down to New York and worked 1 and 2 week periods in the office, and coming back after I finished school, and I worked there for another year, working on Courthouse Square and a couple of the projects in New York City.
Thank you.
I have a Zeckendorf story to tell, too. This is like a trip down memory lane up here. But when I first came out here, I went to work for a company called the William Kostka and Associates, a public relations firm, and one of our accounts was the Courthouse Square, and it was just dragging along, and it was embarrassing to the city, and so Zeckendorf did come out and was in the process and had purchased it, and we were going to have a big press conference, and Zeckendorf and IMPay were flying out. And they were getting here like about 10:30 at night. And it was my job as the new person in the firm to go and meet them. Well, they got off the airplane, and it was so long ago, it was the kind of airplane where they walked down the steps, and I saw them coming down, and they didn't seem to be too steady on their feet. Well, it turned out they'd been drinking champagne all the way in, and I had Zeckendorf all set up in the station master's office out at the airport to have a press conference. And so he seemed to think he could pull himself together. And he sat at the station master's very nice mahogany desk with a letter opener in his hand. And every point that he made, he stabbed that desk. In the meantime, I and Pena are in the back of the room in hysterics because the whole thing was just completely comical. And we got tremendous coverage because we had discovered gold on, this is a public relations thing, you know. We had discovered gold in the land where the courthouse had been. And so everyone got extremely excited about that. And the rest of their visit was filled with sobriety and seriousness, but the takeoff was simply great.
What a great story.
The ultimate story of the gold is that Zeckendorf had anticipated that the gold strike that he thought he had in Courthouse Square would pay for the excavation. In reality, the amount of gold which they took out of the excavation was enough to make him a pair of cufflinks.
Okay, so can we have some questions from the floor?
I couldn't hear that.
I think the question was, after I'd announced that I was always in trouble, he wanted to know what might I have done so naughty that I wouldn't be endeared to my dear friends in Denver. Was that the question? Oh, okay. Well, gosh, it's really hard for me to think of that. But yeah, now with what's going on in the present life of Larimer Square represents that in the preservation business, you can never give up. You can never think that everything's going to be all right. And Denver, a lot of you knew John Prosser, who taught for 50 years at the University of Colorado. And he always said, as far as immigration into the city was concerned, that you ain't seen nothing yet. Because, you know, that with climate warming, which I realize is a national disgrace, but they're going to be coming in very large numbers here over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And we have some things that we have to, I think, kind of grow up a little bit about, and one of them is higher rise buildings. And I happen to believe, well, first of all, the safest place in the United States, and this is really hard to believe it, but per capita, is Manhattan Island. So you can have a fine way of life and great public realm and still have high-rise buildings. And probably, as we are now, I suspect one of the reasons that this has been perpetrated is because of the new Blueprint Denver issues which are coming out and are, I couldn't get myself all the way. No, this is the new one. This is the new one. Well, it does a lot look like the old one. So I suspect there's some sort of an explanation for that. But at any rate, I did around Larimer Square a lot of years ago in the early 80s. I proposed some high-rise buildings. And of course, they already had Larimer Place, where you live. And in the urban renewal area, they had some other high-rise buildings. But you know, if you look, take a little time and get on your Google. I'm usually so mad at them, I can't say their name, but they do give me a lot of information, and I have a tendency to Google around on the weekends. Look at Austin, Texas. Look at Dallas. Look at what's happening. And so we are going to have to do some high-rise buildings. But when I suggested it in the early 80s, I did lose a lot of friends. And now I'm in the midst of an argument with the present owners of Larimer Square because they're wanting to put a 40-story building on top of one of the historic buildings. And in my estimation, they're just beginning to eradicate Larimer Square.
So, as a segue, before we get more questions from the audience, what do each of you think about the Blueprint Denver and its role in the development of Denver?
Well, you stopped us in our tracks. Well, I'll answer. I mean, I think that what was done initially under Jennifer's aegis was quite amazing and has been pretty helpful, although it hasn't necessarily been followed. But it's a good roadmap, and it's time to be revisited. And obviously, I just got this the other day, and a lot of work has gone into it. To what extent this organization has been involved, I don't know. Have you been involved with it?
A little bit.
But I think you should get involved. Always, I think you should get involved.
Alan?
A senior colleague of mine who's no longer with us, the founder of an urban design organization in Pittsburgh, David Lewis, once said urban design is politics in 3 dimensions. And I just can't think of a better definition myself. There have been many definitions. Any document which planners put together, or architects, relative to city planning is just a document, and the implementation of that document is still is part of the political process. And without politicians who understand what the city is in 3 dimensions, and actually in 5 dimensions, are not going to be successful in carrying through the philosophical intent of a city plan. What are the 5 dimensions? Time and people. Okay. And time is part of it, because time always has a way of catching up with bad ideas. We have some bad ideas. One of them, and I'll give you my primary prejudice right now, since it's there, it's being done, and that's the ditch on I-70. I think that's all I want to say right now.
You're in enough trouble as it is.
Sure,
Ron?
I'm in trouble.
Well, I agree. I agree with Alan. That, I think Blueprint Denver as a visioning document is really a good, solid document. But I don't think the implementation of it has worked, and especially in the form-based zoning code that came on its heels. So I think now we know what that implementation vehicle is doing, and we've got to revisit what the vision is.
I think it's really important that the community be involved in Blueprint Denver, and a lot of people don't know what Blueprint Denver is. I'm on a strategic planning committee at Metro State University for the president, and even the people there at the university didn't know what Blueprint was. And so at our next meeting, we're having somebody from Blueprint Denver to give them a review of what's going on. They've got another public review coming up on on Halloween, October 31st, that people should get involved in. And you can get online and log on to denvergov.org /Denverite and put some in. I think there's been a survey that you can do some input on there. But it's kind of a fluid document over the years. And you know, I don't think Denver was expecting this influx of people in the last few years that we've had. So, you know, sometimes you need to go back and rethink those zoning issues and those kind of recommendations you're making around mobility and transportation and land use and housing. So I would recommend that all of you get online and look at that blueprint and make some comments.
Yes.
I wish that were true, but it's not. There was extreme citizen involvement in the creation of the zoning code. There were citizen groups that were intimately involved, and so everybody, any faults in the zoning code was everybody's mistake. And there are some problems. The problems came to a head a couple of years ago when all of a sudden the slot homes started being built. And that problem has been resolved, but there are other structural problems in the form-based code, which I don't object to. I think the idea of a form-based code is a good one, but the problem is that all of the permutations and combinations that are available when you give any hint of how a form might be done or how it might be resolved design-wise, visually, is given in the code, it does make way for a lot of bad stuff. But unfortunately, a lot of citizens were involved in the formulation of the code.
Yeah, I remember during that time that Alan's talking about, the council members across the city were involving their council district in that zoning code. And there was a lot of input because I remember a lot of people unhappy about the way District 3 was handled. And so I do remember the citizen participation. Sometimes zoning does what they want, but even with citizen participation, but it was there. And it could happen again, I think, you know, through... You didn't? I did. Oh, okay. I did participate in it, but then it got changed from what a lot of the neighborhoods were heading to. Wanted, yeah. Yeah. Participation, but that doesn't mean that they listen. Well, that's true. I'm not going to argue with you about that.
Well, we still have, we have the issue of, we have professionals who are very sincere in the work that they do. And it's their job, not the citizens, to take that input and make it work for all of the city. And it's a really difficult job. And I do this. I've done the same thing in my own practice, where I've had groups of the actual potential users of a project give me input as to what they want to see in the project. But the ultimate project is still a synthesis of all of those ideas, and one has to evaluate all of them and come to a conclusion and make a decision. And as all of you know, making decisions is not easy. And when you get to as complex an organism as a city, it's very easy to make mistakes.
Yes.
And
Dennis Gallagher, retired auditor, councilman, senator, representative, whatever you name it. But I just want to say that the quality of the meetings that the city has are greatly lacking. Because what they do is the mayor will come in and give a nice little talk. The audience is not allowed to ask any questions. And then some of the people from the city give their little talks. And then you break out and go into little tables. And you're assigned a little colored round circle. And you put your little colored round circle around the preference that you have. This is not true meetings. This is not true community ethical process going back and forth. So until we get a new system of feedback for the city in neighborhood meetings, I think all this is just pretty much like the bagpipes, hot air. But I want to just say, comment on how this is working. In my beloved neighborhood of North Denver, where I was raised and walked to school every day, I used to admire the setbacks that we used to have, the fact that you drive between 44th and 46th and Tennyson now, every development is right up to the sidewalk. There's not 5 inches for some of the Italians to grow tomato plants anymore. It's gone. It's lost. And there's a guy writing a book in Denver now called Denver Fugly, the ugliest places. And right in North Denver, my own neighborhood, is where he's taking most of his pictures. If that's working, I guess I missed out on something. I just want to close on a more participatory note. Forgive me for raving on here, but the comprehensive plan that's coming up, nobody's quite paying much attention to it, I don't think. We've got 5 different, if I remember correctly, 5 different consultants, all going off in 5 different directions. This is planning at its worst from what I can tell. So Professor Tom Noel and I in a group have come forward with some suggestions for the comprehensive plan. And I ran out of staples today, Michael. I no longer work for the city. So I ran out of staples, but I've got copies of this, and I hope you'll let me give you one. And finally, I've got a lot of comments on this 5 different consultants, how they should unify that. In my retirement, I've had a lot more time to read all this stuff. So I do think we have to do a lot better, and I know we can. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you very much, Dennis.
Over here.
Mile High Center, 1954, 55, for my money, is still the newest building downtown. The design is timeless. It still looks gorgeous. It's one of the first modernist structures downtown. It reminds me, by the way, I sat next to Gene Amel at the Rocky Mountain News for many years. He never forgave Bill Zeckendorf for chopping down all the elm trees that his grandfather had planted around the old courthouse. And they took them out when they built the May DNF right there on that block. But that gets me to my point. Dana, you talked about design review and how that has been an essential ingredient for preserving the character of downtown. Why can't we, and this is something I want to propose on council, why can't we incorporate design review into our zoning code to preserve the character of our neighborhood? Incorporate design review to every neighborhood.
Actually, that's a very good idea. And if you want to be inspired by a community that's done a great job with design review and the results are quite marvelous, get Portland, Oregon, and the manner in which they approach, particularly they have sort of 3 different tiers of buildings. And if it's a very, very important civic building, the design review is so directive that all of the developers will go out and get some of the top architectural names of the world that come in and compete. So the quality of what is happening there is quite outstanding, and the systems that they have are quite detailed.
Interestingly enough, there is some talk in the new documents that the city has put out about creating design review in all neighborhoods. How that will be implemented is still, as I've said before, a political issue. Design review has been very successful in several areas in Denver. It's been successful in lower downtown, certainly. It's been relatively successful in Cherry Creek recently. Some of you may not like the density that's being built in Cherry Creek, but that was inevitable, I'm sorry to say. Land prices have governed all of that development. But I would encourage design review, contrary to what Dana said about my previous feelings. Design review can work. It's a very iffy situation, and it has to be done right. And I can't tell you what that is.
Okay, we have another question over here.
I'm a proud sixth-generation native of Denver. One of my favorite pastimes is going through Denver with my dad and hearing his stories of the neighborhoods that he grew up in, the buildings that he worked on, and with the new Larimer Square proposal, I literally threw my phone across the room. So, to my friends and family, but one of my favorite pastimes is going through Denver with my dad, and he says, I worked with so-and-so on this. I remember building this. I remember when this was being built. I remember going on Market Street or Larimer Street and riding the streetcars on such and such and going out with the farmers out to their fields or going to Denarville Market to help them sell. How can younger generations of natives who want to keep the character and charm of Denver alive, how can we get involved to preserve the history of Denver, the Denver that I know, the Denver that my dad grew up in? I want to be able to preserve that for my future generations and for the students that I teach. So how can we get involved?
Well, a lot of us up here and a lot of you out there know that the way you do it, of course, is that you get a group of people over coffee or a cocktail. And I think that in the groups I speak to, I would say only 10% now of the people who are there are originally from Denver. And then maybe another 5 or 10% might have been here 25 years. So I would encourage you to invite a lot of new people to your organization and share with them your pride and your knowledge and encourage them to get involved and to vote, because we still have a large number of Americans out there that think their vote does not count.
I would also suggest that, and join your neighborhood association. If there's a citywide organization that you can join that. And those organizations can have a great deal of impact. I don't actually live in Lodo. I live across the alley from Lodo on Larimer Street.
You're forgiven.
But I have participated in having an impact on Lodo. So, for example, the old Cook building. When that building was going to be developed, they wanted to put in a W Hotel, and they wanted to go above the 132-foot limit in Lodo, and so they asked for permission to do that of the Lower Downtown Design and Review Board, and we got organized and we went there and we argued against it, and they voted against allowing them to go above that limit. As a result, there's no W Hotel on that corner. The developer who did come in and develop it he was going to use the new zoning code to make a solid block, and we sat down with him over coffee and explained to him that we were going to fight him tooth and nail, but it would be better if we could just come to agreement. And we did. And he only has half a block, and he set it back a bit so it doesn't encroach too much on our building, and we don't encroach too much on his building. So there are ways to fight, and they can be successful.
From my understanding, back to blueprint and design issues and planning documents, that 80% of the new development in Denver since blueprint happened in the areas of change. So the idea of putting the density in areas of change worked. One of the things that I think failed is that it didn't curtail, and this goes back to the zoning piece of the plan, it didn't curtail the fights between neighbors and developers that are unnecessary. How would you suggest in this next round that we create in this plan or some mechanism where predictability is built in and we can stop wasting everybody's time fighting?
I'm not sure we can eliminate conflict when it comes to design. I think inherent in any plan is going to be some conflict between the interest of the developer, who's always looking at his bottom line, and the interest of the neighborhood, who are looking at their environment. And every design that anybody does is always a compromise between those two things. And the best compromise, obviously, is where nobody is happy.
Okay, so Phil, go ahead. Last question.
You're all great community orientation and good taste, and sadly, you cannot legislate good taste, okay? So I'm curious if you know of anywhere, in the country, in the world, that gives a little protection or a little upgrade of what really is happening in Denver now. We're seeing hundreds of pre-tenements built. They're buildings you're not going to love in 5 years, let alone 30 years. They're nondescript 3- and 4-story buildings where everybody thinks they're a temporary resident. So, and it's a bottom line thing. I mean, your point about that tension's great, but has anybody been able to successfully push back? I know you can't elevate taste, but is there any place, South America, anywhere, where they've actually said, hey, we want to build a place where we want to live, not someplace we live and move away from?
If you want to live in a dictatorship or monarchy, it's possible. Because the most successful cities in the world are those which were originally developed under authoritative government, where government had the power to actually define the form of the city. And you know those cities as well as I do. Paris, Rome, Berlin, Moscow, Leningrad, you name the city. Those were the major cities in the world that were built before our concept of democracy existed. When the forms of those cities were already determined, they are fantastic. We all know how they work, and they work great. And they work great for pedestrians. They have the same problems with traffic that any other city in the world has, but they're controlled environments, and everybody loves them. But we can't do that with our democratic form of government. It's just not in our DNA.
And that's the rub, because like Paris zoning, it actually defines the footprint of the building and the volume that you can build. And so the architect's job is how to fit, whatever you want to build in that footprint, a house or a shop, or and then what does the facade look like? And there are very strict design not guidelines, but standards that you must follow there. So it's, it's socialistic. That's not what we have here. And that's, I live in Wheat Ridge. We are going through this neighborhood revitalization strategy, and, I coined the term Highlandification. That's something that we don't want in Wheat Ridge. There are individual property rights, right? And that's the push and pull, and I don't have the answer to that, and but I'm struggling with that too.
So a few more
I think that there's a way, with all this gentrification that's happened recently, I think there's a way that the city could work with the developers so that it doesn't cause huge displacements with elderly and with people of color that have resided in these neighborhoods for generations, decades. And, there are other cities that have some best practices around these types of developments and growth that are going on in their city. And I think Denver really needs to kind of look at some of those best practices across the country and try to replicate some of them, because I know many, many people that have been displaced and can't afford to live in Denver. Newsett has a home ownership program, and nobody can afford to live in Denver. We have down payment assistance money from the city. You can't use it because nobody can afford to live in Denver, and it's a real shame that our teachers and our firemen and our policemen and are being forced out of the city. And so I think there's a way to solve this problem. Even if we live in a capitalistic society, I think there's a way to work with these developers so they just don't run ramshot through our city.
So, final comment from Dana.
Mark Twain said, this is sort of apropos of nothing, but he said, if you want to go to heaven, it's for the climate. If you want to go to hell, it's for the company.
Thank you, panel. And now we will have lunch over on the side. I see it's all set up. And then we'll come back at around 12:30.